Ethan had already turned off most of the lights in the small-town garage, the fading scent of motor oil lingering in the air as he wiped his hands on an old rag. It had been a long day, engines, carburetors, cranky customers, and the kind of work that left his muscles heavy and his mind drifting toward the quiet comfort of home. He was just reaching for the door when he heard the softest sniffle, a sound so fragile it barely rose above the evening breeze. He paused, turning slowly, and found a little girl standing near the entrance. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, her pigtails slightly crooked, her eyes red and glistening with tears that clung to her lashes. She held something in her arms pressed tight against her chest, as though afraid the wind would steal it from her. Ethan crouched down, resting on one knee so he didn't tower over her. "Hey there," he said gently, making his voice softer than he used with adults. "Rough day." The girl hesitated, then stepped forward just enough for him to see the object she had been clutching. It was a small mechanical fire truck, once bright red but now dull from years of love. One wheel dangled at an odd angle, the ladder hung loose, and the little plastic siren was broken clean off. The girl sniffed again and whispered that it wouldn't light up anymore. That she had tried to fix it herself, but she didn't know how. That she didn't want her mom to throw it away. Ethan could see how much she loved it. The corners were worn smooth from tiny hands, and the chipped paint told stories of playtime adventures. He asked her name, and she said it quietly, Lily. Then she told him the part that made Ethan's chest tighten. It had been the last gift her dad gave her before he passed away. She said it quickly, as if afraid she might cry harder if she didn't get the words out fast enough. Ethan felt a familiar ache tug at him, the same one that surfaced whenever memories of his own struggles as a single parent resurfaced. He understood love wrapped in small objects, understood grief that hid inside toys and bedtime routines. He stood and gestured for her to follow him. Lily watched him with wide, uncertain eyes, but she obeyed, stepping lightly as though afraid she'd somehow cause more damage to the toy just by moving. Ethan flipped the garage lights back on and guided her to his workbench, clearing space between wrenches and spare bolts. He didn't usually fix toys, cars were his world, but he had worked on plenty of delicate things before, especially when his daughter was younger. Dolls with missing arms, music boxes that refused to turn, tiny robots whose gears jammed from too much enthusiastic play. "Let's see what we can do," he murmured, taking the toy with careful hands, as if it were something far more fragile than plastic. Lily climbed onto a stool and leaned forward, watching every move with intense concentration. Ethan removed the bent wheel, straightened the axle, and tightened the tiny screws that had long since loosened. He repaired the ladder using a bit of solder, then wiped away grime that had settled in the grooves. When he opened the underside compartment, he found a loose wire responsible for the lifeless siren. With practiced ease, he reconnected it, testing the circuit. A faint glow flickered on. Lily gasped, pressing her hands to her mouth. Ethan smiled, one of those warm, quiet smiles that made the whole garage feel less like a place of work and more like a safe corner of the world. He replaced the battery, secured the casing, and turned the small fire truck around to face its owner. The siren lit fully this time, blinking in soft red pulses. The ladder clicked into place. The wheels spun smoothly. The toy looked whole again, maybe even sturdier than before. Lily's entire expression shifted, her sadness melting away, replaced by astonished joy as she reached for the restored fire truck. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the button, and when the light blinked again, she let out a shaky laugh that filled the room with a fragile kind of happiness Ethan hadn't realized he needed to hear. Claire Hartwell pulled up to the garage in a sleek black SUV that did little to hide the frantic beating of her heart. She had driven straight from an emergency meeting, barely hearing her assistant's reminders, barely remembering the last sentence she'd said to the board. All she could think about was Lily, her little girl who had slipped away from her in that brief, chaotic moment outside the grocery store. Claire had only turned her head for a second, answering a work call she'd tried so hard to ignore. And when she looked back, Lily was gone, leaving Claire's chest hollow and cold in a way no business crisis had ever made her feel. When she caught sight of the open garage door, fear twisted in her stomach, urging her to move faster. She stepped out of the SUV so quickly she almost stumbled, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete as she rushed inside. Her breath caught when she saw Lily sitting safely on a high stool, leaning close to a man in a faded blue work shirt and smudged jeans. He was showing her something, no, fixing something, and the sight of her daughter smiling with that rare, unguarded delight made Claire freeze. For a moment, the tension gripping her body eased, but only momentarily. She hurried forward, calling Lily's name, her voice breaking in places she didn't want anyone to hear. Lily turned at the sound and slid off the stool to run into her mother's arms, still clutching her fire truck. Claire scooped her up, holding her close, inhaling the familiar scent of her daughter's hair mixed with faint traces of dust and engine grease. She whispered a shaky apology, promising she wouldn't let her out of sight again. And for a few seconds, she forgot the presence of the stranger entirely, until he rose from his crouched position and offered a small, reassuring nod as though telling her everything was all right. Claire straightened, smoothing her blazer and trying to regain the poise people expected from her. She apologized hurriedly for the trouble, her voice professional but laced with lingering panic. She explained she hadn't realized Lily had wandered into the garage, that she hoped she hadn't interrupted his end-of-day routine. She half expected judgment or annoyance, maybe even a subtle jab at her for letting her child roam alone in a town she barely knew. That was the reaction she usually got from people when work tangled too tightly around her life. But instead, the mechanic simply offered a calm, steady smile. There was no hint of irritation or criticism in his eyes, only kindness, the sort that felt warm enough to dissolve a bit of her guilt. He introduced himself as Ethan, his voice gentle and unhurried, as if he wasn't speaking to a CEO known for moving through conversations like a storm. He told her Lily had come in with a broken toy and that he'd been happy to help. Claire glanced down at the fire truck in her daughter's hands and realized it looked nothing like the damaged piece she'd seen earlier that morning. It was practically glowing, freshly repaired, polished, functioning better than it had in years. She blinked, genuinely surprised. She'd given up on fixing the toy herself months ago, resorting to hiding it on a high shelf when Lily cried over it. There had never been time to find an expert, and she certainly hadn't expected a small-town mechanic to treat something so small with such delicate care. She found herself asking how he had done it, not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. Ethan shrugged lightly, rubbing the back of his neck, downplaying his skill as though it were nothing. That humility startled her. In her world, people boasted constantly, never letting a chance at praise slip through their fingers. For a moment, she just stood there, unsure what to say. Lily stayed close, beaming up at Ethan as though he had fixed more than just a toy. Claire felt something unfamiliar tug at her chest as she watched them, a strange mixture of gratitude and an unexpected softness blooming in a space she had kept locked for far too long. Claire didn't leave right away. She told herself it was because Lily was still excitedly testing every button on the fire truck, but deep down she knew it was something else. Something about the calm, grounded presence of the man standing across from her. The garage was quiet except for the faint ticking of cooling metal and Lily's delighted giggles. The air smelled of oil and warm concrete, yet Claire felt oddly comfortable, as if she'd stepped into a pocket of stillness far from the frantic rhythm of her everyday life. Ethan leaned against the workbench, arms crossed loosely, watching Lily with an expression that was both fond and distant. Claire recognized that look. Parents carried it when memories slipped in unexpectedly. She found herself asking if he had children, a question that felt strangely personal given they had met only minutes earlier. Ethan nodded, saying he had a daughter, older now, already in high school. He said it with a mixture of pride and something a little sad, as though he missed the days when fixing small broken things for her had been part of his evenings. Claire listened more intently than she expected. She wasn't used to people speaking without trying to impress her or gain something. Ethan talked simply, honestly, like a man who didn't need to perform. She found herself letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Lily, perched on the stool again, pressed the little red button, and the fire truck's siren lit up with a bright, steady glow that reflected in her eyes. She showed Ethan proudly that it worked perfectly now, and he knelt beside her, admiring her excitement as though it were the most important thing happening in the world. That small gesture, the ease with which he matched a child's joy, softened something inside Claire. She sat on the edge of an unused tire and allowed herself to relax for the first time in days. She told Ethan she hadn't expected anyone to be able to fix the toy. She admitted she'd been hiding it on a shelf because every time Lily saw it broken, it reminded her of things Claire couldn't repair. Her voice wavered slightly, a crack she immediately tried to smooth over, but Ethan didn't pry or look at her with pity. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging that parenting sometimes meant patching up hearts in ways no one else ever saw. Lily hopped down from the stool and trotted over to her mother, holding the truck up for her to inspect. Claire traced a thumb along the freshly polished edge and felt a surprising sting behind her eyes. It wasn't the toy itself, it was the fact that someone had taken the time to care, to mend something she'd quietly believed was too broken to save. She glanced at Ethan, wanting to thank him again, but words felt too small for the weight of the moment. Instead, she asked if it had been difficult to fix. Ethan chuckled, wiping his hands on the same rag he'd used earlier, and explained the loose wiring, the bent axle, the misaligned gears. He spoke with a quiet passion, the kind that came from years of working with his hands, knowing how the smallest details could make something run smoothly or fall apart. Claire found herself listening to him the way she used to listen to people before her world became boardrooms and deadlines, fully, without checking her phone or her watch. Lily settled on the floor, making soft siren noises as she pushed the truck around in small circles. Watching her play so freely, so happily, Claire felt an ache in her chest she hadn't expected. It was the ache of relief, of gratitude, of a loneliness she hadn't had time to acknowledge slowly lifting. She looked back at Ethan and realized he hadn't just repaired a toy, he had given her daughter a piece of her childhood back, and in doing so, he had given Claire something too, a glimpse of gentleness she hadn't felt in a very long time. She stayed longer than she meant to, talking, listening, letting the conversation drift naturally as if they weren't two strangers from completely different worlds. Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't rush, didn't judge. And Claire found herself wondering, for the first time in years, what it felt like to meet someone not because of who she was professionally, but simply because she was a mother, worried and tired, hoping desperately to do right by her child. And somehow, in that quiet garage with flickering lights and Lily's laughter echoing softly, she felt seen in a way she hadn't expected. Claire returned a week later, though she told herself it was only because she happened to be driving through that part of town. The truth, however, pulsed beneath the surface like a quiet confession she wasn't ready to voice. She had thought about Ethan more often than she wanted to admit, about the steadiness in his eyes, the gentleness in his hands, the way Lily had glued herself to his side with complete trust. In Claire's world, people tried too hard to impress her. Ethan hadn't tried at all. Somehow, that made him impossible to forget. She parked the SUV outside the garage and hesitated a moment, smoothing her hair even though she knew it was ridiculous. She had faced journalists, investors, full rooms of people predicting her failure, and never once had she felt nervous about walking into a simple mechanic's shop. Yet here she was, clutching 2 cups of coffee and taking a slow breath before stepping inside. The familiar scent of oil and warm metal greeted her, and so did his surprised smile when he looked up from the engine he was working on. "Well, this is unexpected," he said with a warmth that immediately softened her tension. His voice wasn't loud or overly cheerful, it was calm, genuine, exactly the tone that had lingered in her memory all week. She handed him one of the coffees, pretending she hadn't rehearsed what to say at least 5 times on the drive over. She told him she was grateful, that the fire truck had hardly left Lily's hands since the repair, and that she wanted to say a proper thank you. Ethan accepted the cup and nodded, but his eyes held something gentle, something that told her he saw more behind her visit than she dared speak out loud. Lily poked her head out from behind Claire's legs, holding the fire truck proudly, as though she feared Ethan might forget what he had fixed. She ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist with complete familiarity. Ethan laughed, lifting her briefly, and the simple gesture pressed something tender inside Claire. She watched as he set Lily down and crouched beside her to ask about school, the toy, and whether she had managed to keep the latter intact this time. Lily chatted easily, leaning into him with shy affection that melted Claire's heart. Ethan invited them deeper into the garage, clearing a space on a rolling stool for Claire while Lily went off to explore a box of small spare parts he assured her were safe enough to examine. Claire found herself sitting comfortably among tools and engines, a place she never imagined herself fitting into, yet somehow she did. She watched Ethan wipe his hands on a cloth, his forearms strong and dusted with grease, and realized how refreshing it was to see someone who didn't live behind polished surfaces or guarded expressions. He asked how her week had been, and for once, Claire didn't filter her answer through the lens of professionalism. She told him the truth, that it had been exhausting, overwhelming, and filled with moments she wished she could slow down. She confessed she sometimes felt like she was living two lives, one as a mother trying to make space for her daughter, and the other as a CEO carrying the weight of thousands of expectations. Ethan listened without interruption, without that polite nod people used when they didn't actually care. He simply listened, quietly absorbing her words as though each one mattered. Claire felt herself relaxing, her shoulders loosening as she talked. She told him how Lily had been happier this week, playing more, sleeping better. Ethan smiled softly and said maybe it wasn't the toy that mattered, it was what it meant to her. And to Claire. The words sank into her in a way she hadn't expected, leaving her breath caught for a moment. When Lily returned to show Ethan a robot she had made from bolts and washers, he admired it with exaggerated seriousness, earning a burst of giggles that echoed warmly across the garage. Claire watched the two of them together, and something shifted inside her. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was quieter, deeper, like a seed taking root in a place inside her heart she thought had long since closed. She realized then that Ethan hadn't just fixed Lily's toy. He had gently, unknowingly repaired something in their lives, an invisible crack that she had been ignoring for far too long. And as she sat there, sipping coffee that was now cooling in her hands, Claire understood that meeting him had already begun changing things in ways she didn't quite have words for yet.